Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are today. Thank you so much for joining another Joy of SharePoint and PAIT Group webinar. Today, we're going to talk about a hot topic because it's summertime. We're going to keep it hot. Migrating to Microsoft 365. I am joined with my, should I say cohort or co-worker? I mean, both are kind of true. Stephen Wilson today. He and I talk to people all the time about migrating to Microsoft 365, what it means, what it doesn't mean, and some best practices. We've also seen some worst practices that there's a good chance those will get surfaced today as we go through it. But if we've never met before, I'm so glad you're here. My name is Joy Apple. I'm a Microsoft MVP and a modern workplace strategist with PAIT Group. I have been working with Microsoft products and technologies for almost 13 years now. I've been a farm admin, trainer, consultant, and now I strategize on getting people from where they have been to where we all want to be. It's where the cool kids are with Microsoft 365. Stephen, how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. I'm all ready to go with a minor demo, and I actually had a conversation with a customer today about, it's one of our customers that we're getting ready to do a DPS with, and they mentioned this, and they were like, "Oh, you and Joy keep mentioning migration, but we're not really migrating." And I was like, "Oh, I thought you guys had like a bunch of content in some file shares, and like half of your group was in Google Documents or like Google Workplace." And they were like, "Oh, well, yeah, I mean, we have that, but we're not migrating." And so I think when we said migrate, they were thinking SharePoint to SharePoint or something like that. But this conversation and sadly, not only do we talk to customers a lot, we talk to each other a lot about this. Like we get on the phone and we just start talking about it. But just moving any kind of content into Office 365, whether you're moving it into Teams or SharePoint, or if you're even migrating, your mail system or something, we refer to that as migrating, because if you're just putting content in there, it's more than just dumping stuff in place. Oh, and hi everybody, I'm Stephen Wilson. I'm a it says SharePoint architect. I'm an Office 365 architect, so I do things around all of Office 365, and also do some of our work around like security and things like that. So I'm more of the technical back end to the kind of stuff that Joy talks about all the time in her Twitter and in her blogs and things like that. I'm kind of the quiet, nerdy back end of a lot of that stuff.
And I am the loud, nerdy front end of all that stuff. I tell people, I actually describe folks when I'm doing the deployment planning. I said at some part you will meet the yin to my yang for the Microsoft 365 stuff when we bring you in to start talking about it. And you'll see as we go through this today, Stephen and I come at this from very similar perspectives, even though we at times have very different opinions. I think we always end up at the same place, which is pretty great.
And I think we both got there from experience. It's not like we coordinated or anything. Like we just sort of landed in the same place before we started working with each other.
And it's funny when you're out there talking with folks in the community that have been doing this a while, there may be differing opinions, but the best practices almost always line up, if not lockstep, right? There's different flavors and ways to do things. The best practices come through, and the word you used absolutely applies. It's experience. We've seen things. We've seen what works. We've seen what doesn't necessarily work. And we take all that together, you boil it down, and that gives you those best practices.
Yes.
Let's set the stage just a little bit. So can versus should. Because when we're talking about this moving of content and getting things consolidated, into Microsoft 365, there are a lot of things you can do. There are a lot of things that people have done, but it wasn't necessarily the should. And I'm curious, as we go through, anyone that has any questions or previous experience, I would absolutely love if you would join in the chat and kind of share what those are as we go through it. Because I would love to know what your experiences are, or if you're stuck somewhere as we go through and you see something on the slide, you're like, yes, that right there, that's where I am. How do I get past that hurdle? How do I jump there? Let us know. If you don't really want to go to chat, because yeah, I mean, there are some other people that might see that. I'm going to have contact information at the end and you can kind of ping us offline and we can help you out a little bit. But yes, you can pick up everything, lift it out of wherever it is. It could be Google Docs, it could be Dropbox, it could be SharePoint 07, 10, 13, 16, 19. It could even be SharePoint Online, but maybe it's classic and you're trying to figure out the best way of modernizing. It could be from a variety of locations. Should you just, as it is today, pick it up, lift it, and shift it over into modern SharePoint Online sites? Should you? I mean, you can. Should you keep the structure that you have in place today, the architecture that is there? You can. But Stephen and I just kind of put the high points here for the, but should you? My new favorite analogy is moving, because I did it about 6 months ago. Oh, never would be too soon. But yes, you can just box up your house as is and move it somewhere else. But should you? Do you want to move those clothes that you just haven't cleaned out of the closet and put them in your new closet? Do you want to keep everything exactly as it is, not organize, not sort, and move it? Sounds messy to me. And it sounds like, Stephen, on a scale of 1 to 10, how expensive is SharePoint storage?
How sensitive is it?
Expensive.
I mean, probably on a scale of 1 to 10, it's probably somewhere in the 8 or 9 area compared to other, storage options. I mean, when you talk about SharePoint, you're not really talking about it as a storage facility. You're talking about it as if it were a service that does other things. So it's got a lot of features in terms of management and things like that, that, you don't really look at it as storage primarily. So you've got like, Azure files, you've got Amazon storage and things like that are much cheaper on a per gigabyte basis than SharePoint would be. And I think we may have lost Joy. No, there she is. She wasn't moving on my screen. Normally, it's not normal for her not to move. Usually she's kind of frenetic.
It's not normal at all. So yeah, definitely the concept of lift and shift comes up a lot. But yeah, why would you move the policies that haven't been relevant since '98 into your brand new environment?
Yeah, I look at this the same way I look at a lot of things. I mean, people will say something to me and they're like, we did this recently. But when you're talking about technology, recently is 3 months ago. I mean, we try our best to keep up with the changes in Office 365, but it's a constantly moving target. And so if we try to move your environment or anybody's environment into Office 365 3 years ago, we would have a different approach than we do now.
Definitely.
Because there are a lot of things that have changed over time. And so to say that you're going to take basically the same setup that you had in 2007 when you were doing stuff mostly out of file shares or something like that, and say that that is the business process that you want, and that nothing about it can be improved by any of the tools that are available in Office 365, is a little mind-boggling to us. That's not to say that you're not right, because maybe you have put a lot of care in maintaining the way that you do business and things like that, and so you've got it honed down to a really perfect setup. But most organizations, just chaos has crept up on them. Everything trends towards entropy, and so they just have a lot of dead files, a lot of dead folders. People have joined the organization, people have left the organization, and so there's usually a lot of cleanup when you're going through that data. And again, I mentioned I was just talking to a customer. Out of 800 gigs in a file share that they had, they suspected about 100 of it was actually relevant.
Wow.
And that was just one of their multiple file shares, but that was just while we were on the phone. They just kind of went through it, and they were like, a lot of this is people's personal files that they should be keeping here, or that they are keeping here, but these are the older copies from years ago. And that he mentioned that like one user was using about 30% of their file share space. And it's that kind of thing. You kind of, you just haven't looked at it. You don't think about it. And then suddenly you realize like, oh, wow.
Yep.
I mean, if you looked at like your internet usage, it's almost inevitable that like one person in your house is using most of the internet, and it's probably the person that spends a lot of time on social media or something like that. Often it's your kids or something, but employees have different styles of doing things. One of the people in that call mentioned that they had 96 gigs of stuff on their current machine, and their machine crashed last week, and they just got all their data back. But she realized, in the conversation that we were having, she was saying, I just had a crash, and I realized that, yes, we should be doing this differently, because, it was a big warning bell for her.
And that just emphasizes too, like you said, there's old content, maybe folders that belong to people that aren't even in the organization anymore. So if we do that lift and shift, and we keep that exact file structure, that means we're lifting and shifting data that belongs to people that aren't even here anymore. Might have been their personal shared files. And you're like, oh, well, that's easy to clean up. I recently went through a process for a customer that does project files. Used to be on a file share, but all they did was copy that folder structure, put it into a documents library. So when they have a new project they want to do, they copy the folder structure, boom, project XYZ. He said, the performance isn't that great. And people are kind of seeing that it's running a little bit slow, and they'd really like to take advantage in Teams to have this real-time communication while they're working on these project files. He said, this folder structure is not working really well. So I was like, well, let's hop on a call. Let's talk about how I could help you with that. So we did that. And they have one, you would open a folder called, I think it was inspection reports, nothing except one folder called, oh shoot, like something inspection reports was in there, and all the content actually went into that folder. So why do we have that middleman, right? What's the point of that folder if all it does is hold another folder? So we went through, we broke out that structure. So now you can utilize the benefits of Teams, but by keeping that exact structure from file share to SharePoint, it wasn't working the same. They knew there were advantages to changing. They just didn't know how to change, right? And sometimes you just need that little extra help. Those folder structures are old. It's a conversation we've had a lot lately. When you go to duplicate your file share inside of SharePoint, you're basically backwards engineering SharePoint to a 30-year-old technology.
And I always find it funny when we get on the phone with a customer and they start to show us what they have. And then a lot of times, one of the first things they say to us is, I didn't design this.
It's true.
They're like backing away from it. Like, this was not my idea. This is not This is not how I would have done it. And it's like, well, here we are. You're in charge now. Like,
So what are we going to do
do it
with
your
it?
way.
Yep. Well, and when you start looking at that and you're like, okay, well, we know what we shouldn't do. And in our heart and soul, even if we're thinking we're just going to lift and shift, we know that's really not the best way to go about it. So what should we do? This slide is simplistic, but we're going to break it out even more. But first off, evaluate your content and your processes. And we're going to kind of expand these thoughts into about 5 steps. But first, even if it's just going, well, we know this is old and not needed anymore, pitch it, right? Start mapping out processes in advance so we make sure the people that are going to need access can get to that stuff. Identify how that new structure should be built. And again, we're going to go through this more and more, but these are the very first 2 things to think about, because these steps actually break out bigger. Evaluate what you have. And you could even break that out into inventory.
And before
right?
she goes any further here, like in the chat or whatever, if you thought to yourself when she showed that first slide, if you're like, oh, that's never going to happen, we don't have time, just put like a yes or a Y or something in the chat. I just kind of want to get a breakdown of whether that occurred to people, because it's a worry. I mean, I'm not saying it's an illegitimate statement. I'm saying, that's one of the first things. So one of the reasons to show this slide, like the next one is where we get into more detail, but at least start this, at least look at this and say, okay, we have to do some evaluation and we have to think a little bit about where we're going. Because while it seems faster to just jump straight to dumping things in there, that's going to cost you time.
Yes.
In the long run. And it's going to be time that you also don't have. You don't have time to just wait for people to, watch the screen load. So like she said, some people were saying, well, the performance is not good. And it's like, because the performance for a file share and the performance for SharePoint are based on 2 totally different things. SharePoint is meant to work in a different way because it's meant to manage your content, manage your documents. It's not just meant to store them. So by dropping all of those features that allow you to effectively search things, effectively sort through things, getting rid of all that and just going straight to, folders, it's more convenient up front, but you lose a lot of productivity after the fact. So even a little bit of planning, like what she was talking about, where you just drop that first folder because it's not useful. It's just a subdivider. Dropping that is worth some productivity. And so anywhere you can think like, okay, we can do a quick thing and we can, change this. Even things like just going through and making your folder names make sense, getting rid of the extraneous folders, getting rid of things where if you look at the whole thing, like they've used the same folder name like 3 or 4 times because they put data. It's all data, so maybe,
Yep.
Maybe don't put data in a data folder.
That
Sorry.
makes sense. No, well, I was thinking as we were talking through this, I could have had this slide where just big X comes up and on top of it, we just stamp planning, because that's what this is, right? It's just planning. I had a director of IT once. He was actually a very great guy, very intelligent, but he had this annoying habit and he would say, well, let's just throw something against the wall and see what sticks. I mean, okay, but you're the director of IT and I'm the SharePoint admin. I'm the one that has to clean up what falls on the floor. And we say all the time, oh, we'll just go dump it in there and then we'll clean it up later. No, you won't, because we're busy. We're so busy. And if it's going to take time to plan, it's going to take a lot more time to go clean it up later, because now you've got to convince people to pause again and do something else again. Why didn't we just do it when we were in here on the project the first time?
Right. And so even if you can only do a few quick hits, if you can just do a couple of things, these are not hard and set steps, but these are all areas that you can look at when you're doing this work, and you can say, okay, this is something that is really important for us. Like we want to define an information architecture, or we want to, get rid of extraneous content. We've got some ideas around, what to do with extraneous content. So while it's done step by step here, this is just an ideal. This is not a hard set rule.
And inventory content, it should actually, it says work with your content owners. Almost every step of this is going to involve working with content owners at some point, because we're IT people. We don't really know and understand, and we probably most days don't really want to know and understand how accounting works with their documents. We don't want to know how marketing goes through their logo approval processes when it's time for a rebrand. I mean, we need to know what impacts us for the tool set. Oh, you need flow, right? You need an approval, you need a place. Awesome. But they can tell us how that should work behind the scenes. Who needs to be a part of that? What does it look like now? How can we make that better? So let's jump into, come on, buttons, click. That'd be amazing. Thank you. Inventory. And this is still hitting hard because of my move 6 months ago, and it's just across to the other side of town. But going through, looking at what you have, what's going to go to the new place. If the concept of really weeding through every document, it just hurts your heart. You feel a little bit of yourself just kind of shut down because you're like, there's just no way. Could you maybe draw a line in the sand and say, okay, let's only look at stuff that's 5 years old or newer, 3 years old or newer. That'll be our first pass. But knowing what you have and looking how it's architected right now today, even if it is a hot mess in a file share or in Box or in Google Docs or whatever, hot mess, that's fine, but look at it. Because more than likely it's in a folder structure, unless you kind of modernized a little bit already, maybe in previous versions of SharePoint. But those really big folders, you go into, Acme Corporation all, and you break that open, and you have accounting, HR, IT. That's already identifying architecture, because we know when we move to SharePoint, we're going to work out of sites. HR is going to need some sites, and that really big folder is reinforcing that. If you see a folder that says benefits/payroll, well, that's telling me we probably need a site, maybe a working site, maybe teams to come in and give us a place where it's cross-functional for the HR benefits team and accounting or payroll. So just looking at how we've got things organized now helps put you ahead of the game for building out your new information architecture. The next level of folders in that department folder is probably going to be libraries. So just by looking at what you've got can really help identify what you need. Stephen, I feel now's a good time to bring up those folders you built.
Oh, sure. Hang on just a sec.
Oh, do you want to do it? Because I got it pulled up too.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. You're already sharing your screen.
Yeah. So this is how much we script this. All right. So this is just an example of what a home page, a landing page might look like. And Stephen went through, I'm going to jump over into site contents, and he built out just some sample folders inside of the documents library. Because let's face it, if we have a site that's never really been fully planned, it's a chance everything ended up in documents. And what he built for us here were some company folders perhaps, what was your intent, Stephen? Are these customers
This
of
is
SharePoint?
this is kind of the same thing that we see a lot of times when we come into an organization. They've organized things by customers or project or something like that, and so they create a folder for each customer, and they put them in their documents library. And so this is it's a parody. It's not a perfect example of what the customers show us, but I think we've seen structures similar to this many, many times. Mm-hmm. So, first level, the customer. Second level, and we see this a lot, where they've just divided things up by year, and then they store them that way. And then that's as far as I went on the levels, and then I just put the documents in here. But I've done a few things differently in some of the different folders here. So here they just put stuff in, named the documents, stuck them in there. That's it. If you back up to one of the other customers, Tyrell's fine.
Tyrell Corporation's up too.
Yeah, go ahead and open up one of those. And you'll see the word Tyrell at the beginning of each document. Mm-hmm. That's very common. And we'll see that where, each one of them, but then the one at the bottom says yearly Tyrell. So they broke their habit. They have the customer name first most of the time, but on that one, they didn't do it. They put it second, but it's got the word Tyrell in it. But the first folder, there was no customer name in the folder, in the content. The names of the documents were just something random, and they didn't have the customer name in them. And we see that a lot because the people who work on the Tyrell stuff don't necessarily work on the engine stuff. So they haven't really coordinated how they're storing things. So when someone else comes in to search for something, there aren't a lot of rules. It's just like, it's easy. You'll go in and you'll see it's the customer name, and then it's the document name. They're divided up by year. But like this one, mm-hmm. They all have 2020. Some of them are at the beginning. Some of them have, WY instead of Wayland Yutani. There's not a lot of consistency there because there's not really a good way to enforce consistency with file names. People name it whatever they name it, and then they upload it, or they, create it here, but they name it randomly because it's just a string. And so this is the kind of stuff, this is kind of what it looks like in the file share.
But much cleaner, I have to say, because when you really bust open a file share, you might see Engine Technologies all, right? And then you see those breakdowns. And I joked with him, I was like, are you going to create a working drafts folder? Because usually you go see working drafts and then you see final. And if you open up the final folder, final is going to be in the name of everything. And sometimes it's final.final stop editing this.
I actually have made some file names that are similar to that, but I didn't go crazy with the folders. Like this is just, like I said, it's a very basic thing. And at first glance, it looks organized. At first glance, sure. You're like, okay, yeah, it's in the customer, and then it's by year, mm-hmm. But then you start to realize like there are some problems with finding things. If you don't already know where it is, it's kind of hard to figure out where it might be.
Yeah, if I'm a new JoyofSharePoint employee here and I need to go find all the ordinances that we have given to our customers, I get to go on a drill down. Maybe I search, but I've noticed it still search is not intuitive for folks for work content. We're used to searching the internet, but not an intranet. And maybe part of that is because we've been hurt by search before and it's not been that great. But if we were to break out some of this content and to actually seriously apply metadata to it, ooh, search would get so good. So just thinking about that, I'm going to jump back to slides for just a minute. But if we start thinking about, okay, this is what we have. I'm already identifying basically some additional libraries I can create because these should be their own. I can have a column with year in it. So now I can just see all this stuff, right? I don't have to go open up folders. So it already, the architecture we have in place is going to start informing our metadata and the architecture that we want to move into. So determining, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and so you mentioned that one of the things that you noticed was that they should be different libraries. That's something that might not be immediately apparent to us when we look at a library.
Sure.
In that case, she just saw that, by habit, maybe these should each be in a different library. But if you know that each one of those folders has different security, like who can get into Tyrell is different than who can get into Engine, that's something that we can't see necessarily because we're looking over your shoulder. You may be an administrator, you may be a manager, and you have access to all of it. But then later on, when we find out that that's divided up by security, that changes our recommendation. And so
significantly.
Yeah, and so those kinds of things you have to kind of think your way through, like, why is this a folder in a library when it has different security? Because anytime you break that security, it's a time to look at whether it should be a different library or a different site collection or something like that.
And my first glance saying, oh, well, those should be different libraries because they're different topics. That could be wrong. If the customer name is not the big deal, those company names, but those are all documents that this one group in the company has shared with those, then the document type's important, but what should be metadata is who all has received a copy of this document, right? So you can always pivot that. Organization is important, and it takes planning and time and really investigating the content to know, how are we using this? Who should be able to read it? Who should be able to edit it, right? What's the life story, that sounds dramatic, for this documentation? And to know that we have to work with our content owners, our business
Joy, you're breaking
users.
up a little bit.
We have to, what it's up to, one of the ordinances, might have expired 2 years ago and there's a new one in place. Get rid of the old one so it's not junking up search results, right? That's to help search not suck. We got to get rid of the garbage because it doesn't know it's garbage. It doesn't know. We just search for the word policy and SharePoint's like, here's a policy. Is this the one you want? Oh, here's a whole bunch of policies. Are these the ones you want? It doesn't know. So examining and the determining what we're moving is going to be super, super critical for these first few steps. As we do that, we start to define the information architecture. This is where I totally geek out because playing with SharePoint sites for me is kind of like playing with Lego blocks. There's so many different ways they can fit together, and you can get similar results. It's not a cookie cutter. You don't have to follow the pattern of the Lego box, that, but let security be your guide. Stephen mentioned earlier, we see that all those customer folders or company folders have different permissions. That's immediately telling us that those need to be secured in their own, probably their own sites or something. Because if it's important enough to break the permissions, then it's important enough to actually pull out and put somewhere else where accidents can't happen and the wrong people get to it. Maybe those broken permissions wasn't closing it down. Maybe it was opening it up and letting people from other departments come in to work on these processes or these documents. So a cross-functional site, maybe a team site and a team that's shared with multiple departments is appropriate. When you're going through, my first question typically is like, who needs to get to this? Is this for everyone in the company? Or is it just for a certain group or a couple of certain groups, right? Is it company public or is it department or private, project private? And once we determine that, who edits it? And that's building out our permissions, and that's also letting us know where those site boundaries need to be.
And Microsoft has actually made this a little, I don't want to say clear, but they've made their preference known by the design of teams. You know,
Yeah.
so those of you who've been working with SharePoint for a long time, you may know that, you know, almost everything is secureable individually. You could put permissions on each individual document in a library. I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying you could. So back to the first point, just because you can doesn't mean you should. But you have that option. In Teams, that becomes much more difficult. Microsoft has very much limited the way you divide up things in Teams, because if it's in Teams and somebody is a member of that team, by default, they will see all of it. If they're a member, like actually listed as a member, they can edit all of it. And so that's a big readjustment for some groups. Like some groups have really divided up their content so that only certain people can get into certain folders, only certain people can, see certain files or edit certain files. Microsoft has taken a much more collaborative approach to everything in Teams. So if somebody's a member of the team, by default, they can edit it. If it's a document in that team, they can edit it. And that may drive you nuts at first, but it guides you towards making decisions about who can see and who can touch what. And so, for good or bad, working against the way that Microsoft envisions you using the product is a quick way to get yourself into trouble.
Yeah.
And so they've layered a different type of security over SharePoint with Teams. And it's hard to mix the two. So just because you can see the folders in Teams doesn't mean that you should just go ahead and secure them the way you used to and expect people to deal with it in Teams. It really doesn't flow very well when you do that. So you have to kind of reimagine how you divide up things based on who you want to be able to see stuff, edit stuff, that sort of choice.
Mm-hmm.
SharePoint still works the way it always has. And if you're just sticking with SharePoint, you can do more of that dump. You can just move things over the way they were. Again, I'm not saying you should, but if you look at it through the lens of Teams, that can make you make some different decisions about where you put stuff.
I'm making faces.
Yes, I can see your faces. I don't think they can.
I know they couldn't. That's why I was making them. I put my favorite Teams phrase that I coined in the chat. If you're in the team, you're on the team. Right? It just, if they should, Joy shouldn't be able to edit that, then you need to kick Joy out of the team, or you need to move that thing that Joy's not supposed to be editing. One's got to go.
Or
but
make her a visitor.
That's a webinar for another day. Okay. So defining the information architecture, and like Stephen said, who should be able to do what. And yeah, you have the ability to do a lot with security. If you've got content that people absolutely do need to be able to see, and it belongs on a team site and there's a team, but those people don't need to be part of that chat. I mean, they're ancillary to the team. Put them in the SharePoint site. There's ways to make that happen. The architecture is still there for you to leverage. All right.
Absolutely is the most Joy word I've heard today.
Just today, did I double click? No, I didn't double click. Ooh, this feels like a video game phrase. Choose your weapon. No, choose your migration method. That's what we're talking about on this slide. There's a lot of ways to get your stuff where you want your stuff to be. Okay, I almost said the E word. some of them are not as taxing on your users as others. Maybe that's the way to put it.
Yes.
The Microsoft migration tool, it's free, dare I say freemium. It can help you move stuff, but it doesn't, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, it cannot help you map and unnest your full file share structures. Am I still correct on that?
You are correct on that. I mean, it can help you move things into proper structures. It takes a bit of scripting, and you have to do like some spreadsheet kinds of things like comma separated values and stuff like that. So the Microsoft migration tool is probably more appropriate if you are not planning on changing any of the metadata, so to speak. So if you're not worried about adding more information about the content in the move, then the Microsoft migration tool may be one way to go. If you're not too worried about the amount of relocation. So if you can say like, okay, everything that is in this folder in the file share will go into this library. It may not stay in the same format. We may not, keep the same folders and things like that. But if you've got one folder that's going to be going into 10 different directions, that's going to take a significant amount of work on your part if you're going to be using the Microsoft migration tool. And none of them make that easy, but some of them make it easier than others.
And that leads us to the third-party tools. Stacy, nod your head. We're good to say names, right? Yeah, so there are two primary migration tools that we work with. They are both great companies. There are, it depends on which one you would want to use for your exact situation, but ShareGate is one we use a lot, and AvePoint Fly is one we use a lot. Both of those are fantastic tools that can get you where you need to be. I personally, I don't do the tool migration anymore. That falls on Stephen and Allison, and they've got me out doing different things now. So I never actually got to poke the buttons on Fly. I have ShareGate, intuitive, user-friendly. AvePoint, I mean, that's a name we've all known forever in the SharePoint world. But those are tools, Stephen, you can talk more specifically about it, that you can start to unnest those structures, map out what this subfolder content is going to, where it's going to go, what it's going to be. And I think you can create those constructs on the fly. Would that be an accurate statement?
So to speak. I mean, I think with ShareGate, it's probably a bit easier to do things on the fly, so to speak, ironically, because the other one is called Fly. And in concept, ShareGate is more like just a dual pane file manager. You've got the source and the destination, which makes things easy in sort of a conceptual way, because you can sort of just, say, okay, I want to move this from here to here. Fly is where its strengths are, is you can construct the migration kind of ahead of time. So you can go through and you can set up all the different aspects of your migration. And so you could set up literally, okay, I'm going to start in this location and I'm going to move this to 10 different places. And you could go through and set up that move ahead of time. And then you could tell it to just run all of those migrations at one time. So you could like kick it off on a Friday night and then just sort of check in on it through the weekend. You can do that with ShareGate, but it usually requires a bit of scripting. It's harder to queue things up in ShareGate. So with ShareGate, you can, create all those jobs ahead of time, but it's hard to queue them up in a way that they'll execute one after the other. You have to tell it like, okay, start this one at 9, start this one at 10. Well, if the one that you started at 9 runs for 4 hours, and then the one you started at 10 runs for 6 hours, and then you start one at 11, you start to kind of stack them on top of each other. Whereas with Fly, you can tell it like run this one, and then when this one is done, run this one. So they each have their own strengths. I think that Fly is more of a quote unquote migration tool than maybe ShareGate. ShareGate has some functions that are handy sort of after the fact, and it's a good tool for reorganizing, moving things around in your environment, kind of like you said, just the ad hoc stuff where you're like, oh, I just want to take this and put it here. Fly can do some of that, but its intent is really as a migration tool. And it has they both have a number of reports that you can run on your content if you're moving from one thing or the other. And they will kind of do some analysis for you. And they can do some things with, helping you find security breakdowns so that if you want to, know who has access to what in the old environment, you can kind of run those sorts of reports. And they can give you, information about your content before you move it or after you move it. And so I think both of them are worth having around after the fact. The SharePoint migration tools, on the other hand, only if you're just going to be moving stuff around again, would you need it? It doesn't really do you a whole lot of good as a report tool or something like that. That's not really one of its strengths. And just real quick, I'll cover the drag and drop. I think drag and drop is kind of an underrated thing. A lot of times I hear, people want us to move like their OneDrive content in. They want to move from file shares, into OneDrive, and they want us to do it for like 300 people. We can, if we're going to do that, typically you're really going to want a third-party tool because you have to get access to each one of those OneDrives individually. But a lot of times it's easier just to tell your customers like, okay, you got everything in your S drive, move it to OneDrive. And because OneDrive doesn't have metadata and things like that, it is more of a, lift and shift kind of target, because if they want to reorganize their content, they can. But if they're the kind of user that's like, nope, this is how I like it, this is my stuff, I want it this way, absolutely, put it in your OneDrive your way. But we still we recommend that people kind of look at that content themselves and say, do I really need this? Like I've got a doc template, not a docx template, a doc template that I haven't used since 2008. Maybe I can get rid of that.
Yep. And, if you've got a library somewhere, you can always do the OneDrive or sync it down to your desktop and then do the drag and drop over into the new destination, show them how to tag it. There's a lot of ways you can do bulk tagging in SharePoint. Again, that's probably a webinar or a video short for Stacy for another day, but there are definitely options there. So it doesn't have to be a tool. It can be where users actually touch it and maybe you help them clean it up as they're moving it. 2 birds, 1 stone, maybe.
Actually, we just demoed to a customer the other day an app that we developed for a customer so that they could basically drag content into one place, set all the metadata for it, hit a button, and then it would move it to another one. And so, we have worked with customers on those sorts of questions before, and there are ways to automate it. There are some ways, to change the metadata by just using a drag and drop option. You might want to bring up the files that we were looking at before and show some of the options for reorganizing that content. If you look at the different views there.
That's true. So yeah, back to the JoyofSharePoint in these company or customer, whatever those may be, folders. Over here, Stephen went and created views. So views are SharePoint's version of subfolders, right? So instead of having to drill down, you could just use the metadata instead of folders and say, okay, tag all of these documents with the partner. And you're gonna say, wait, Joy, that looks exactly the same. What's different? I mean, there's some different ways to do it. Stephen actually did the dual grouping here. First, he grouped by metadata, not the folder. And then by year, you could alleviate one of those levels and just have the year be a column right out here. There's definitely options. But this lets you see, oh, there's 4 documents for 2020. I could go in, open up a different one. It's jumping different than it used to jump. That was weird.
Yeah, when you click directly on it instead of the arrow,
it didn't like
it jumps to it. Yeah.
Okay, it's changed. But here's some categories now that we've applied. So heck, now if let's say instead of, I don't know, 5 documents, there were 500, I could come to this filter button and say, okay, SharePoint, show me everything that's tagged as a legal document. So now I'm not only using filters or columns to sort and filter, I'm using columns to slice and dice my data. That becomes pretty powerful. And we're not forced to work inside of a folder construct that someone created, 10 years ago. We also have by year. And this, I'm guessing, nope, you did the dual group again. Again, you could leave it all open if you wanted to and just say, show me every document for 2018, regardless of the partner. There's options, but if the partner is super important and needs to stay attached, you can absolutely rock and roll this way. This, even though it looks nested, it's not. It's completely flat, and search is going to perform better for this.
And the reason I did the first one, the by partner, and made it look almost exactly the way the folder breakdown was. Sometimes, we get customers telling us we can't change this. The people know where it is. This is it. And so we can go at least 2 levels deep and keep that same kind of structure. You can't do 10 different levels, but doing 10 different levels is actually, a problem no matter how you want to do it. When you're talking about folders, it creates problems with search. It creates problems with, the file path length. But you can replicate some of it. And that's one of the reasons to get rid of all those extraneous folders. If you can get down to just the heart of how this content is organized, if you want it organized by partner, you can do that. And then you can use filters to break it down the rest of the way, or you can group it in some other significant ways. But you want to get to the heart of why you're doing things the way you're doing it. And then when we flipped it by year, you just look at your content and you say, okay, one person designed this folder layout. One person said this should be done by partner, but there's another person who never touches anything from past years. So they may set up a view that only shows content from 2021. And they may only care about content as organized by, legal or policies or reference. They may not care about any other content. And so by tagging it with that information, that allows them to get straight to, the legal documentation. So when she was mentioning, we want to know about the ordinances, she can go and create a view that only shows the legal stuff. And it can be divided by partner. It can be divided by year or whatever she wants. And it's her own private file structure. And so instead of you having to work through the manager's file structure, where the manager is like, it always has to be through the year and always has to be through the partner. And you're like, but I don't care about any of that stuff. I only work with like 19 documents out of these 80 some documents. Can't I just have a way to get to those 19 documents instead of having to worry about digging through this file structure every time? Yes, you can if you use metadata.
You can. So that brings us to, it's funny how this all just kind of works together. Preparing your environment and designing a structure that's going to meet your needs and your content owner's needs to get to those things as they need it. Do not have to drill through X number of folders or sites to have a navigation that's intuitive, so they don't have to go through 5 or 6 clicks to finally get to the site they need to on the intranet. Looking at pain points, sharing content. We all know working from home when all of our stuff was on the file share and we had to all go through VPN all day long every day, that's a pain point, right? So how do we eliminate some processes outside of our content, inside of our content structure, without losing things, without sacrificing security, right? There are out-of-the-box features inside of modern SharePoint that can replace a lot of custom solutions that are out there. Web part rollups now on modern SharePoint sites, pretty fantastic. Do I wish there were more? I do, but that's because I'm greedy. We can still do better rollups now than we've ever been able to do without zero custom code. So when you build that structure out, we've looked at the big folders. We know we need partner folders for Engine and Tyrell, and we know we need certain pieces of metadata such as year and category or purpose. Build it up, then bring in the content to that new structure. Don't just use the old structure as a map. Use it as a guide or an example of how it could go. But this is your time to really make it shine and to meet the needs and solve the problems that you've had all along the way. So the next slide is the last, I think it's the last working slide. Yes, it is. Archiving. Stephen and I mean, we'll just have random calls where it's like, do you have a minute? And we could probably, if we had the time in the day, we could probably talk for hours about how to help customers come up with an archive plan, because there needs to be a plan. Where are we going to put the old stuff that our content owners have determined we don't need anymore every day, but we have to hold on to it? I might need to go back and reference that one day. Where should that go? How will people get to it? Stephen's brought this point up many times, and it's just the first time he said it, I was like, oh, that's such a good thought. How are users going to get to the archive content if and when they need to? IT needs to be aware of it. Whoever's managing that archive needs to know that people are still going back to get content, because maybe it shouldn't have been archived, right? When we know people are no longer going back to it, does legal say we can get rid of it? Maybe it's time to get rid of it. No one's touched it in a year.
And that's, you asked the question early on about how much, different types of storage cost. Maybe it's time to move these things out of SharePoint altogether. Get them into something that costs pennies per, gigabyte, or, something along those lines where you can get it out of the active content of SharePoint. It's no longer searchable. Putting things where people can't get to it is important, because if you have to go and get it for them and you're in IT, then you're more aware of where that friction is, and then you can move it back into active content. So usually when people say, like, how did the users get to the content? I usually say they don't. That's usually my answer. They don't. You get it for them.
Request process.
And that may be a little painful, but in the end, the information is worth it.
And if it gets too painful, that's when we go, okay, wait, why is IT or accounting, why are they needing to get to this archive all the time? What's going on, right? Maybe it's time to reevaluate that. And just remember that things are going to change. We've actually had people say repeatedly, well, yeah, we're going to migrate everything into SharePoint, but we have to keep the structure the same because we don't want anything to change. People can't handle it. They'll freak out if it's too different. Just by moving it, you have changed it. Bookmarks aren't going to work, right? Shortcuts aren't going to work. A SharePoint site looks different than a file share. You're already changing it. So seize the day. Communicate. Socialize. Demo. Give sneak peeks. Ask them questions. Bring them along for the ride to help determine how their own content should be structured, right? It's theirs. But things are going to change, and that's okay, because the payoff in the end is going to be so much better than that learning curve up front.
Yeah, change sucks, but if you're going to change things, try and make something better along the way.
Absolutely. And that said, we are at time. You guys have spent a whole lunch break with us, and we appreciate it. This is how you can find us. So Joy Apple, Stephen Wilson, we do both work at PAIT Group, rock stars. But yeah, I've got the QR codes for our LinkedIn profiles, which apparently Stephen thought was weird, but he still sent it to me. Those are our Twitter handles. You can also find me on Instagram at JoyofSharePoint. Our YouTube channel is here because I remembered to do that, Stacy.
And to be clear, it wasn't that you wanted the QR code. It was just the fact that you thought I would have it in my hand.
Okay, fair enough. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the day. Now it's time for me to go and scene.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
And thank you, Stephen, for being here.
You're welcome, Joy.